Good afternoon, friends. Honorable Vice Chancellor, Patna University, the Honorable Director of Sinha Institute, the Chair of the History Department and Professor Pushpendra and other esteemed teachers and my dear students. The reference was made to Papia Ghosh. Papia was a very dear younger friend to me, and I had wanted very much, when I was the director of the Maulana Azad Institute of Asian Studies in 1996, I wanted her to join my institute. And she had said that she would consider it whenever she would come to Calcutta or would meet elsewhere. She would be telling her of her own research, which was extremely, I thought, significant. And when we started the journal on migration called Refugee Watch, we were proud to publish one of her early writings, very significantly titled as Pakistanis and Indians Abroad, Who Are They and What Do They Do? Later on, when we made a selection from Refugee Watch, by the time she had her unfortunate death, so she had committed to write something else, but she could not, and then we had republished her article, and she is a dear friend. She was a dear friend, and I think she symbolizes many of the virtues that we hold dear to our life. Before I begin, I also want to offer my apology, because I know that if I had been able to speak in Hindi, it would have been best. But I can speak in Hindi, but I cannot discuss social science in Hindi. I am not trained. So please forgive me for my inability. This lecture will be for about 40-45 minutes, and then I hope that notwithstanding the language, we will be able to find some time for discussion on what I want to say. The title, as you know, is that why should we go back to the histories of immigration of late 19th and early 20th century. Historical comparisons with the late 19th, early 20th centuries are needed at times to develop a genealogical perspective on current discussions and debates in the politics of migration, with particular reference to the formation of systems for the governance of population movements. The perspective has to be wide-ranging in that it should encompass several case studies and historical examples. This broad perspective can enable us to focus in terms of its conceptual development, particularly in our effort to show how the emergence of the migrant as a source of insecurity accompanies the migrant's emergence as the subject of our time. Studies of migrants as distinct from migration as a process show how the migrant had emerged as the figure of the abnormal in the context of the insecure circles of insecurity that make our nationalist universe. To understand fully the implications of the emergence of the migrant as the most unsettling element of our time, we have to appreciate the significance of the historical question of immigration and the attending control practices. Recognition of the value of the two strands of research, national history and labor history, is necessary towards that. All these will involve A, analyzing the connections between the nation form, the labor form, and the ideology of humanitarianism, and B, a similar analysis of what we call empire as the space of control of population flows. First, more than any other strand of history writing, labor historians have tried to recognize the political significance of migration in the later half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. Since Stephen Castle's co-authored work on immigrant workers and class structure in Western Europe, published in 1973, some excellent studies have appeared on labor migration and they indicate how a different history of the nation form can be constructed. Such a history would tell us the histories of the trajectories of citizenship, including what T.H. Marshall had termed in 1949 as social citizenship, along with histories of inclusion and exclusion. Second, along with the writings on general labor history, we have special studies on export of indentured labor and the growth of plantation economy, which again suggest a different way of writing the history of the nation form in the last 2 centuries, where the extra-nationalist narrative of indentured labor constitutes a different universe. These 2 facts only show the permanent disjuncture between the history of the nation and the history of labor. In fact, the new crop of historical studies on various aspects of welfare state and schemes, inspired in some cases by the Foucauldian theme of governmentality, suggest a different way of understanding modern governance, where a study of the nation is not at the center of our political understanding or the study of a region. In its place, we have the still largely unwritten history of governing a mobile, unruly world of population flows, occupying a much more critical place of significance. These works, some referred to in posts of this speech, give rise to a sense of the hidden histories of conflicts, desperate survivals, and new networks growing, as well as old networks being transplanted across great expanse and zones. Studies of hunger in the 19th century, of itinerant movements, transportations of coolies, spread of famines, shipping of children, adult girls, trafficking in sex, labor and human organs, and welfare legislations to cope with this great infamy tell us how actually we have arrived at our own time of subject formation under the conditions of late 20th and early 21st century neoliberal empire. This is certainly different from, as I argue, the tradition of nation-centric histories. Take the case of the transportation of indentured coolie labor or that of the children. We know something of the transportation of the coolie labor, though we ignore the facts of return after the expiry of indenture of the indentured labor back to the native country in the early part of the 20th century, owing to improved transportation and communication facilities, thus making circular migration of labor possible. But we know very little of the ways children were sent across seas and deserts as labor force. In a volume titled Uprooted, the Shipment of Poor Children to Canada, 1867 to 1917, and published in 2008, the historian of transportation of child labor, Roy Parker, gives us detailed account of exportation of hundreds of boys and girls from England to Canada in the second half of the 19th century and the first few decades of the 20th century to work in Canada, to be beaten, sexually abused, slave labored, all to build up Canada and to rid England of its poor, destitute children. This was also roughly the time, immediately after the American Civil War, when, if you recall, Chinese labor was imported to the United States to build the Central Pacific Railway line. People speak of monumental engineering tunneling feat amidst snow and rare air at the heights of Sierra Nevada in 1867. There are now films, museums, and archives on the railway line construction. These material, however, are mostly on companies and the enterprise of the businessmen, yet not much on the details of the immigration of labor, labor forms, labor conditions, etc. Except that what we get from the very few books on the Irish and Chinese labor in railway construction in the United States. Chinese peasants from the Canton province began arriving on California's shores in 1850. Initially, they took 5-year stints in the mines, after which they prospected or accepted jobs as laborers, domestic workers, and fishermen. They faced intense prejudice and increasingly restrictive laws limiting work opportunity. Leland Transford and Governor of California promised in 1862 in his inaugural address to protect the state within, quote, the dregs of Asia, unquote. However, in 1865, the Central Pacific Railway Company started recruiting Chinese labor because of acute labor shortage. Most of the early workers were Irish immigrants. Railroad work was hard and management was chaotic, leading to high attrition rate. The source mentioned above also tells the railroad lost uncounted men to snow. Avalanches could cut down dozens at a time. There was one large snowslide at Strong's Canyon known as Camp 4. 2 gangs of Chinese for tunnels 11 and 12, also a gang of culvert men, for instance, in one incident were in the camp and were buried under snow. The slide took all, and one of the culvert men was not found until the following spring. Even when tunnels were done, maintaining them was a monumental task.
Sorry to interrupt. He seems to be.
Yeah. Even when tunnels were done, maintaining them was a monumental task. In the spring of 1868, most of the high altitude tunnels were completely blocked by ice, which had to be blasted loose and shoveled out. Plus, we have to also remember that all these were achieved by mass murdering the Native Americans so that land could be conquered by businessmen for construction of railways. Then, after the conquest in 1876, the United States celebrated its might, gathered in part from the completion of the railroad at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. Among the exhibits, one could see the very aristocracy of the Indian nation and the heroic feats of the Chinese labor for construction of railways. The struggle was over, as the exhibition pamphlet said, and the Native American tribes had been rewarded and recognized, and the Chinese labor duly acknowledged. Again, we know very little of the resistance of the Chinese labor, except the famous strike in 1876, when on 25th of June, the Chinese workers left their grading work along a 2-mile stretch on the eastern Sierra slope and went back to their camp. They demanded $40 a month instead of $35 and a reduction in work hours. A workday on the open Sierra lasted from dawn to till dusk. The Chinese laborers wanted to work no more than 10 hours daily. They also asked for shorter shifts in the cramped, dangerous tunnels. The company bosses responded with stopping food supply at the heights and deployed white strong men. Again, we do not have definite figures of how many workers died before the strike crumbled due to firings. In fact, we do not have much study on this phase of global labor immigration, and the books we have on the construction of railways in the United States are mostly celebratory. Similarly, during the mass importation of labor for mining in Australia, girls, boys and single women would be transported in the decades of the late half of the 19th century and especially in the first half of the 20th century to the stark Edwardian homes in Australia, where, for instance, in Adelaide today, the building being known as the Migration Museum, it would be written on the wall by the charity institution and the city council within quote, "You who have no place else on earth entered this home, never to look back to the outside world, but to take this as your home," unquote. There is this astonishing collection of documents and writings done by Mary Gere and published by the Migration Museum on the occasion of Women's Suffrage Centenary in South Australia, 1894 to 1994, titled Behind the Wall, The Women of the Destitute Asylum, Adelaide, 1852 to 1918, and published in 1994, which tell us the destitute migrants' lives behind the walls. Martin Spensky has chronicled legal quandary over the status of children sent to Australia from the United Kingdom for work in the Australian mines. These children, in her words, were filius nullius, that is nobody's child, in terra nullius, that is nobody's land. We have some other studies conducted little earlier, such as Uprooted Children, Early Life of Migrant Farm Workers by Robert Cole and Senator Mark Hatfield, and published in 1971. Hunger marches began in the second half of the 19th century and continued in the 20th century, both in new and old worlds, colonial and colonized countries, in search of food and job. It is important to see the exploitation of coolie labor as part of this broader history of displacement, with thin line between internal and international migration, much of which is still concealed. Works like Coolie's Capital and Colonialism, studied in Indian labor history, or the earlier published classic work by Jan Bremen, Taming the Coolie Beast, Plantation Society and Colonial Labor in Southeast Asia, published in 1989, suggest the broader connection that we must diligently pursue in the interest of understanding what is happening today vis-a-vis migration and the nation form. In another recent diligently reconstructed account of the late 19th century famines in the context of El Nino spells, Late Victorian Holocaust and the Making of the Third World by Mike Davis, and published in 2002, we again have a different picture of the making of our time, marked by famines and massive population movements induced by dry weather, floods, hunger, and the forcible exit of large peasant communities from the emerging global food market. And on top of that, add the histories of the formation of large armies to fight wars in distant lands on the basis of recruitment of massive number of men of various nations on earth. The works by, for example, Premanshu Bandyopadhyay on Indian sepoys in the British overseas expeditions, and published in 2011 in 5 volumes, attest to this. All these histories are yet to be found in country after country and at a global level. This is also true that another process accompanied this phenomenon. We can here refer to the process of development of basic technologies of governing population flows and trying to achieve in each case the right composition of the population, as we say, the right mix, leading to partitions and new boundary making exercises. On this, we have a substantial literature, yet we do not account for this fact while analyzing the connection between migration, especially forced migration of labor, and the nation-centric history we are accustomed to. All these, let us not forget, happened after the manumission of slavery. The post-manumission period was one of several changing modes of labor process: the slave, indentured, the contract, and the free. These modes historically never appeared as pure types, because much of the availability of labor depended on labor's mobility, making the labor mobile. Indeed, the truth is that largely on the condition of making labor mobile that globalization proceeded. This would always be the underside of the official story of globalization, the subaltern or the primitive aspect, if you like. This would always involve, as Marx explained, the primitive mode of capital accumulation. Therefore, mining, construction of railways, and plantation economy appeared as the primary site of mobile labor, precisely because of the particular nature of labor process involved in these sectors. They foreshadow our age when the entire domestic and care economy has come to depend globally on mobile labor recruitment. transit labor, then as now, occupies a crucial place in capitalist production. Old nation-centric histories give us very little clue to this vast process of population formation. Through all these, two issues have come closer as marks of modern time. On one hand, mixed up, messy population flows provoking desperate governmental responses. On the other hand, innovations at a furious pace in humanitarian methods, functions, institutions, and principles. Suddenly, governments have discovered why people move. Not only because they want to escape violence, torture, and discrimination, which are probably by now banal causes, but they move, we have discovered, due to natural disasters, man-made famines and floods, climate change, developmental agenda, resource crisis, and the like. The humanitarian response has grown accordingly in range. Governments say that they have to gear up not only to emergencies but complex emergencies, a scenario that alludes to a complicated assemblage of factors and elements leading to emergency situation. To understand how these two issues of our time have come close, we need to go back to the histories of population movements in the second half of the 19th and early 20th century. I have some water here. It was then that the basic control systems of population flows were put in place, such as the introduction of the passport, and the visa system, chronicled by John Torpey in his account of the invention of the passport. But also for a broader history, one can look into the works of Martin Lloyd, recording the foreigner, developing labor market management tools to use immigrant labor for a capitalist market and for control of domestic labor, and finally developing a detailed surveillance system. In this law, but more than law, new administrative practices developed during that time. This is how societies of the settled, with their preordained divisions of labor, wanted to return to equilibrium when the unsettling element had been cured of the problem. By controlling the abnormal, who was generally the migrant, normalcy was to be restored. It was during this time that governing the migrant labor became a task of attending to what Michel Foucault had called pathology. The discourse of abnormality was produced from real life events. Here I want to refer to an event recorded meticulously by a historian of immigration in France, who showed how the following event in Paris produced the figure of the migrant as abnormal. Now this is the story. The hesitation of the progressive politicians ended in late 1923. We are speaking of Paris. At 4:30 p.m. on November 7, an unemployed homeless man, a Kabyle from Algeria, entered a grocery store at number 43 on the 15th arrondissement. Khemili Mohammed Suleiman, his name, grabbed the grocer's wife, a 30-year-old Parisian-born woman named Jean Billard, dragged her out of the crowded street, where he threw her on the ground. Brandishing an enormous kitchen knife he had stolen hours earlier, he kneeled over her, tore off her right cheek, slit her throat, severing her left carotid artery. Covered in blood, he turned next to Louis Fougere, who was calming her, wailing her 8-year-old grandson, Emile, home from school. Suleiman then stabbed her. She collapsed, dying on the spot, and it took a quick-thinking neighbor to save the little Emile by pulling him through the ground floor window to safety. Suleiman ran across the street, slashed 2 more people, a young mother who dropped to the ground clutching her child, and a 32-year-old shoemaker from Romania. Finally, while Suleiman stood menacing a group of school children, A construction worker entered the fracas and heaved a paving stone, distracting the madman until a pair of police officers arrived on bicycles and shot him. By the end of this sanguinary episode, 2 women had died, 2 more were taken in a near-dying state to the nearby hospital. The Algerian was also taken to the hospital and treated for gunshot wounds to his hands and stomach. The double murder dominated newspaper headlines and set off a series of popular disturbances. Shortly after the murders, an unruly crowd tried to lynch an unsuspecting Algerian who happened upon them. Petitions circulated demanding that undesirable elements be expelled from the neighborhood. Long articles recounted the lives of the young Billard couple. Recently married and struggling to make ends meet, they had moved into the diverse Grenelle neighborhood from the suburbs about a year before. Camille Billard, the grocer husband, had taken a second job at a nearby brasserie to earn extra money. Reporters tracked down witnesses who claimed that Suleiman took advantage of Camille Billard's absence to woo his wife, frequently stopping by the store to profess his love for her. According to the newspapers, Jean Billard treated Suleiman generously, humanly, sometimes giving him leftovers from a table, but she consistently rejected Suleiman's advances. The theme of the invading libidinous colonial subject, laying waste to La Duc France, could not be more stereotypical. The whole story sounds too far-fetched to be true. The press undoubtedly garbled some of the details and vulgar prejudice distorted a number of articles. Prurient editors, however, cannot be blamed with dreaming up the entire episode, for much of the story never became public. The precinct report included the testimony of a woman who told the police that she had been present in Billard's store for a few days earlier when Suleiman had entered and unleashed a torrent of profanity. Moreover, the building's concierge corroborated published reports that Suleiman had been pursuing Madame Billard for some 6 months, loitering on the street, hanging around the store. When the police asked Suleiman in jail what could have motivated such a horrific crime, he replied simply, "My love for her, unrequited love." Whatever the true nature of the killer's feelings for Jean Billard, news that an Algerian man had murdered 2 French women and wounded 2 others in broad daylight outraged popular opinion and inspired a tremendous response from authorities. Yet, we have to also recall the time. The Fonderie murders dominated newspaper headlines as the Moroccan rebel leader Abdel el-Karim inflicted a series of stunning blows to the Spanish army in the Rif War, leading to a putsch and the rise of General Miguel Primero de Rivera authoritarian regime in Spain. Only the French Communist Party which had become a mass party at that time and exerted a powerful influence, especially as it became clear that they were opposing French attack on Tunisia and Algeria, and they demanded the recognition of the independent Republic. Soon after the rebel leader had demanded complete independence on 10 September 1924, Jacques Dorier and Pierre Simon wrote a telegram encouraging Abdel el-Karim in the name of the French Communist Party, and Dorier toured Hexagon in an effort to stir up hostility to the war. Communist protests outraged socialists such as Motte, making them increasingly willing to work with their erstwhile enemies on the right in supporting coercive measures. That willingness only increased with the formal establishment in 1926 of Michel Hazi's Étoile de Nord Africa, an Algerian nationalist movement with close ties to PCF, which is the French Communist Party. Authorities feared now that communist and nationalist revolution would exploit the freedoms of the metropole to prey on Paris' growing colonial proletariat and then export revolutions overseas. A later report explained, within quote, "Without Paris, Muslim agitation in the 3 North African territories could be easily contained," unquote. Shortly after the Fonderie murders, in March 24, the radical Minister of the Interior, Camille Chanteur, created a special commission to prevent any sequel to the bloody episode and especially to keep order in Paris. He called together representatives from his own departments of Algerian affairs as well as others from the ministries of colonies and labor and the Municipal Council of Paris to devise a strategy to restrict Algerian immigration and to provide assistance to those who invariably would come anyway. Fearing that a complete ban on North African immigration would incite rebellion in the French colonies and drive immigrants into the arms of the communists and nationalists in the metropole, the Chanteur Commission took advantage of France's colonial authority to impose a series of administrative hurdles that significantly limited freedoms guaranteed to existing legislation. The assembled officials of that various ideological orientations voted unanimously to require all passengers traveling from Algeria to the metropole in third or fourth class to obtain a contract approved by the Ministry of Labour, undergo a physical examination, check their level of normality from a government doctor before departing in order to rule out tuberculosis and madness, and to prove their identity by presenting specially crafted identity cards with photographs. Here the story ends. Now, Clifford Rosenberg, the historian from whose work I have quoted these long passages, name of the book being Policing Paris, The Origins of Modern Immigration Control Between the Wars, published in 2006, has shown how events like these were used by colonial authorities to give shape to their immigration policies precisely when part of the colonial political class voiced humanitarian concerns also in order to institute some protection measures for the immigrants. Rosenberg, drawing extensively on the police files in Paris of that time, presents a critical moment in the history of migration control and political surveillance. He shows how in the years of the First World War, the French police, terrified by the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the specter of immigrant criminality, became the first major force in Western world to systematically enforce distinctions of citizenship and national origins. As the French capital emerged as a haven for refugees, dissidents and workers from throughout Europe and across the Mediterranean in the 1920s, police officers raided immigrant neighborhoods daily to scare illegal aliens into registering with authorities and arrested those whose papers were not in order. The police began to concentrate on colonial workers from North Africa, tracking these workers with a special police brigade and segregating them into their own hospitals when they fell ill. Transformed by their enforcement, legal categories that had existed for hundreds of years began to matter as never before. Their categories determined whether or not families could remain together or whether people could keep their jobs or be forced to return. During World War II, we must not forget, as Clifford Rosenberg reminds us, identity controls marked out entire populations for physical destruction. The treatment of foreigners during the Third Republic, Rosenberg contends, shaped the subsequent treatment of the Jews by the Vichy Republic. These new methods of identification pioneered at that time are once again relevant to the present day. They created forms of inclusion and inequality which remain pervasive as rich states of the West find themselves compelled to provide benefits to their own citizens and at the same time recruit foreign nationals to satisfy their labor needs. Again, it was in this period we are discussing when policies in places of laws and directions from popularly elected assemblies started to become critical in governmental functioning. Both colonial and metropolitan experiences show how in this period policies on control and management of societies were enunciated. Relief organizations emerged around this time, which technically would mean an end to vulnerability. Managing moving population groups became the deus machina of modern governmentality. governments began showing awareness of the paradoxical task they faced. How much to keep these groups beyond the pale of visibility, and how much to allow them at the same time to be visible. Mary Dewhurst Lewis, in a book called The Boundaries of the Republic, published in 2007, shows how that to that extent to which migrant labor became crucial for expansion of industries, it had become visible. On the other hand, in a nationally constituted polity and market, keeping immigrant groups confined to almost invisible spaces also acquired high priority. Governments had to deal with enormous confusion. Who is a refugee? What to do with displaced due to famines, disasters and epidemics? What are the extents of government responsibility? Was mitigating hunger a task of government, or was this a sign of inefficient and abnormal population groups? The attempt to solve these dilemmas found expression in various lawmakings, regulations, directives, and manuals of humanitarian agencies like CARE or Bread for the World about how to take care, how to manage camps, how to provide shelter, how to provide food, water, and medicine, while even more initiatives were taken to anticipate the arrival of the migrants in order to keep them at bay, and therefore to build up specially trained forces to prevent the latter's entry. The main body of modern humanitarianism emerged in this time. Destitute asylums, resembling prison houses, were set up by charitable institutions to welcome survivors, particularly girl and elderly female survivors. In all these, one common feature appeared, possibly for the first time, that of treating the migrant as the source of insecurity. The victim of forced migration was now an active body whose soul no longer needed to be saved. Beside the destitute, wretched body would soon and inevitably die. But because this was now an unruly body requiring management and control, this is the point where the migrant emerges as the subject. Let us also note one more paradoxical aspect of our time, noticed first in this period, which we have come to know as primitive mode of accumulation, and this complicates the scenario. Yet this is also the time when governments around the world started to pass laws and take steps towards making the immigrant a natural part of society. Because by and large, the reorganization of labor market must happen within a free juridical space, and that is when various provisions for naturalization, domicile rights, citizenship laws, etc. began to be made, and the relation between blood and territory in defining citizenship was sought to be clarified. It was hoped that such naturalization would help in the multiplication of labor, at the same time retain the heterogeneity of the global space of capital, without which global domination of capital was impossible. All this was an anarchic process and not a thought out and deliberated one. Even though this period was marked by intense administrative centralization, yet the administrative center could do things only to a certain extent, while police, municipal clerks, local politicians, local thugs, gang leaders, mafias decided at the ground level in the suburbs and distant frontier towns on how and to what degree to execute those directives, because they had to have always the primary task in hand, that of ensuring the running of society. The fate of the migrant in various parts of the world was not therefore uniform. Migrants' rights did not develop primarily through any human rights norms. No guarantee was secured from an altruistic civil society and well-informed public sphere. They evolved through contentious claim makings of various collectives and equally complex constitutional and jurisdictional battles. Refuge, refusal, discourses of security and insecurity, and consequent actions by governments and social collectives made this process extremely contingent. It happened in India also. In the period between the establishment of the rule of law in 1860s and the passage of various national security provisions in the 1930s and early 1940s, we have all the sure indications of an emerging democracy that will be marked by inclusions and exclusions, new boundary lines, and a differently constituted national labor market. The nationalist history we read is therefore only mythical, because this myth hides at the same time other turbulent processes of population formation and development of control techniques, only the final signs of which we get in the passage of Citizenship Act, the Foreigners Act, and the finalization of the immigration rules. This is perhaps what Theodor Adorno had termed as negative dialectics, a case where the more we try to think of the nation from distancing ourselves from the material process of labor, the more we are hurled back to the violent histories of labor of the last 200 years. I now conclude. There may be one more reason in this relative neglect of labor history. We ignore the fact that a good part of the nation form we were studying had been based on imperial structures. And the state that this nation was attempting to build was already leaning on imperial traditions and context to grow up. The particular constellations of territory, authority, and rights which supported the emergence of the nation state had imperial lineages in more than one way. Empires had been characterized by several kinds of population flows. Barbarians had always appeared periodically in history against empires. Barbarians represented nothing but migratory movements, and in the context of our time, we may say that they had a decisive impact on borders or the confines of citizenship. As we know, the classic concept of borders arose in the wake of the emergence of the modern state and the geopolitical dimensions within which the individual was historically constructed as a citizen. Nation, state, citizen, border, all these seem to unite in an excellent faith. Now, two things have thrown this faith into disarray. The emergence of the empire once more and the transborder migratory movements which have collectively put our understanding of citizenship in doubt. Sovereignty in the beginning was not strictly territorial, and imperial sovereignty was not so much indicative of the borders of the empire, though as we know the Roman Emperor Hadrian was the first known ruler to have territorial markers put in place to indicate the imperial reach, but more of exceptional powers to be above law and execute lives as and when the emperor felt necessary. Colonialism in this course of history of empire meant, however, new things. A, clear territorial distinction between the sovereign state and the subjugated areas known as colonies. B, clear legal distinction between participants of the polity, that is citizens, and colonial subjects. 3, clearly demarcated sites of developed sectors of economy and the production of primary goods. And D, finally, an effective way of combining territorial conquest, subsequent annexation, and the long-distance control of economies of the world. In this way, imperial forms were taken over by modern nation-state, and the imperial form of the nation was the historically arrived solution to the twined problems of empire having borders and the need to negotiate the territorial limits of the legitimacy of the power of the state. Yet, this strategy had mixed fortunes. While in the last 15 years, the institutionalization of meta-borders as a strategy has served the function of locating and defining imperial land better, it has ill served the function of stopping the raids of what the empire considers to be the extraplanetary animals. Thus, for instance, labor flows from New Europe to Old Europe, or from Mexico, Puerto Rico to United States, threatens the imperial civilizational core of the Euro-Atlantic continent and consequently put pressure on the internal confines of the empire. The border or the confine in this way is continually under pressure, and the stress reproduces itself in the interior of the empire. In this condition, sovereignty is present, but not in one source or origin, but in the half juridical, half economic political space of the empire, where several actors are at work. In short, the late 19th and early 20th century was another period of globalization, when the migration controls were put in place. As now, then too, control of migrant labor was not the concern of government only. Employees, recruitment agents, labor brokers, in sending and receiving countries, lawyers, courts, training institutes, money lenders, and other credit agencies, bureaucrats, municipal authorities, smugglers, and a wide array of intermediaries sought to gain from the transnational flow of workers. Networks grew up, some of them in Charles Tilly's language, transplanted networks. Tilly pointed out that by the early 19th century, evolving capitalist economy and property relations marked the spread of wage labor, separation of households from the means of production, and the rising productivity of commercial agriculture had combined with diminishing land resources and an expanding demand for labor in urban areas to make long-distance migration a rational choice for many Europeans. Local conditions, including land tenure patterns, agricultural requirements, and resource management profoundly influence rates of migration and return. They also determine the kinds of people who emigrated, such as from certain parts of southern Italy, where land ownership was still possible, and therefore the migrant hoped to use their American wages to purchase land upon their return. The sons of, for instance, Norwegian cattle farmers shut out from ownership also left Europe. Possibly, today's situation is better with labor rights in place in many cases. But the fact remains that globalization means globalization of recruitment of migrant labor, even though the situation is not what it was 150 years ago, particularly with regard to migration of skilled labor. In many cases, however, the situation obtaining today reminds us of the time we are speaking of here. For instance, the exploitation inherent in global supply chains of labor. We can today think of the Burmese migrant workers in Thailand. Creation of new economic space virtually out of nothing, for instance, Macau. Filipino nightclub hostesses and girls in Hong Kong, or the Nepali labor there. Women migrant workers in Taiwan, at the massive cities marked by migrant workers and traffic labor, including sex workers. For instance, of Georgian or Armenian care giving women in Athens. The globalization of sex work now proceeds apace, with the internet playing a crucial role. A recent study by The Economist, 9th August 2014, discusses the entry of sex workers of different ethnic regions across the globe in an equally differentially constituted global flesh market. Sex workers from Eastern Europe to older Europe and United States, from Africa and Central Asia to different parts of the globe, following the expansion of the European Union and the global financial crash, now feature prominently in sex trade. Internet has expanded the sex market, helped the trade escape different national legislations, allowed entry of part-time sex workers, and has created new gatekeepers, new forms of surveillance, and new flexibility in hourly rate of sex workers, and has made sex work decentralized. So similar is the case of nursing, which I do not go into the details now. Yet, what we forget is that these new areas of labor power production had to be secured with coercive means in the first place, even today, exactly as in the 19th century, when the sections of colonial population had to be sent as part of the armed forces in sea voyages to the areas where plantation industry was coming up. The coincidence of securing areas of occupation and plantation production is not and was not God-ordained. Premanshu Kumar Bandyopadhyay's account on military expeditions to Southeast Asia from India, sepoys in British overseas expedition, in fact sepoys from Bihar, were there in large number, throws light on an early phase of this process. The echoes of such expeditions in the hinterlands of India or the Amazons, or the forests of Indonesia, or the deserts of the Middle East can be heard today. We do not have to overstretch the similarities of the two ages. These similarities at the same time should not astonish us. If the earlier period of globalization marked by industrial capitalism called for massive supply of labor forming its underbelly, this period of globalization marked by unprecedented financialization of capital and other resources including land calls for similar supply of labor for opening up forests, construction of new towns, entertainment and care industries for instance, forming the underbelly of the beast today. Then too, as now, it was preceded by depeasantization on wide scale. Then too, as now, the process was preceded by massive application of force. In any case, we must now collectively start working on a genealogical account of migration, labor, and the burden of identity in modern capitalism. This will not be, as I have indicated, a straightforward history or a national or only gender-related or only race-related, but several kinds of histories would have to come together and contribute to, as they had contributed to the making of a hugely heterogeneous labor market. The subjectivities produced in that process have contributed to the contentious history of our time. Thank you.